Is Rishi Sunak right on net zero? Is it time for doctors to call off their strikes? And are you working class? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative peer Ed Vaizey, Shadow Skills Minister Seema Malhotra, Reform UK spokesperson and former Brexit Party MEP Alex Phillips, and political journalist and author Steve Richards. Today, Rishi Sunak defends his new approach on climate change.
I'm going to make the big decisions that are right for the long-term interests of our country, even if those are difficult, because that's how we're going to bring change, that's how we're going to build a better future for our children.
The Prime Minister says past leaders haven't been honest about the costs of going green. So will the public be convinced? The government says these strikes are politically timed. We'll ask a doctor why she's taking part.
I look up to him because he is upper class. But I look down on him because he is lower class. I am middle class.
And does class still matter? Let's start with some breaking news. Here is the headline in the BBC. The Bank of England leaves interest rates unchanged in surprise move. Yes, the Bank of England has left the rates unchanged at 5.25%, ending a run of 14 straight increases. And it had been broadly considered that they would probably increase the rates, but latest official inflation data has made market expectations change a little when the rate of price rises came in slightly lower than expected. Your reaction, Ed?
Well, I think homeowners with mortgages will be massively relieved. This is a kind of break from the relentless increase in interest rates. I think the government will be very happy. The government will say that their bearing down on inflation is working. Inflation fell yesterday. Underlying inflation is also falling. It was one of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges. So in what has been a difficult week for the government, I think they can point to this. They will point to this as a success for them.
I'm sure they'll point to it. The Bank of England, of course, makes the decision on interest rates. And you're right, the rate of increase in terms of prices has come down very slightly. What's your reaction to the Bank of England's decision?
I'm very hopeful that we may be moving forward positively, but this is still very high. This is still a sign that our economy is very weak. It has been weakened by years of Tory mismanagement, and even the very slight 0.1% drop in inflation was hardly a victory lap. Prices are still going up, and we are still going to see people paying very, very high mortgage interest rates for a long time yet. And this is even more so for those who will be coming off fixed rate mortgages in the near future.
Alex?
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And in fact, I think the impact of the interest rate rises we've seen to date haven't even hit yet. At the moment, the average family are paying £220 more a month on their mortgage than they were before. The Bank of England themselves project this to go up to £500 a month by 2026, when people do come off fixed rate mortgages. When you consider the average take-home pay is £2,000 a month, that quarter of a salary that's going to disappear for some families out there is going to plunge people into actual poverty. And I think when the Bank of England finally realised the impacts they've had by protecting sterling to the extent of almost rubbleising people's take-home pay, it's going to be far too late.
What about the point, though, Steve, that Seema was hinting at, which is perhaps it hasn't fed through enough yet? Yes, we've seen this slight drop in inflation, but this is one of the major levers, rightly or wrongly, in terms of controlling the rate of price rises. If it hasn't fed through, will it still have to go up in future months?
Could well do. This strikes me as a sort of holding decision in the light of what you were saying, the lower than expected inflation announced yesterday. But there are still inflationary pressures in this economy, and they might have to do something again in the future. Perhaps it won't be until next year, who knows? But I don't think this is the end of it. And isn't it interesting that at this point where Sunak wants to pull all the levers, a key lever is being pulled by an institution over which he has no control. So the
and
fate...
It's been in place, of course, since
1990.
yeah.
And it was a very clever move by Gordon Brown to put it in. But when things are going wrong, the briefings against the Bank of England begin from elected politicians. So let's see how it pans out.
Do you think this is the ceiling, or should be the ceiling, for interest rate rises?
No, I agree with Steve. I think that it's still very, very fragile. And one hopes, you know, the Bank of England has not covered itself in glory. Arguably, it didn't increase interest rates early enough as inflation fed through. And there was, as you remember, a year ago, 18 months ago, people talking about rising inflation as a temporary blip. That was, I'm not an economist, even I knew high inflation was here to stay. And what it is worrying that you take this pause now because of falling inflation. And we know that British inflation in particular, unlike the European inflation, is kind of much stickier, that it comes back to haunt us, and we're back in this kind of vortex, vicious circle. There will be, as I say, a lot of homeowners who see light at the end of the tunnel. We know that mortgage rates are capping out and potentially coming down. That is a good thing. But if we are back in 3 months' time with the Bank of England having to come back with its tail between its legs to raise interest rates because inflation hasn't been flushed out, that will be disastrous.
Let's talk about the story that's dominated the past few days, and that is Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, overhauling measures to meet net zero target by 2050, which he says he's still very much committed to. Let's take a listen to his speech yesterday.
The test should be, do we have the fairest credible path to reach net zero by 2050 in a way that brings people with us? Since I've become Prime Minister, I've examined our plans, and I don't think they meet that test. We seem to have defaulted to an approach which will impose unacceptable costs on hard-pressed British families, costs that no one was ever really told about, and which may not actually be necessary to deliver the emissions reduction that we need.
He's faced a barrage of criticism from within his own party and also from business leaders as well, of course, by climate change activists. Includes a delay on the ban of new diesel and petrol vehicles from 2030, which had been the target, to 2035. Has he done the right thing, Alex?
Well, he's sort of done the right thing, but I'm surprised that there's been all this backlash because it's the smallest rollback in political history. It's pushing something back by 5 years. It's not exactly changing policy, particularly, is it? And what really annoys me about this is the British people carrying the can for climate change when 46% of our emissions are actually through the things that are importing from other countries. And in doing that, in buying stuff from China constantly, who are massive polluters, we're exporting our industry, we're exporting manufacturing. Yes, we're exporting carbon emissions, but with it, we're exporting our prosperity.
All right, has he done the right thing, Ed?
Well, I mean, the politics of this are very obvious. The Tories unexpectedly won the Uxbridge by-election. They won it on a climate change agenda, which was the unpopular tax that Rishi Sunak is imposing on drivers. They've seen an opportunity. It's good to see a Brexiteer like Rishi Sunak seeing the light and aligning us with Europe, which is really the way forward, that we have to align our regulations with Europe, our biggest market. So the Europeans have the same 2035 target, which is a reason why this policy is not actually a sort of catastrophe and the sky is not going to fall in. So the politics are obvious, and the bad politics are also obvious because the government looks like it's chopping and changing, U-turning on a whim, and losing direction.
My question is, has he done the right thing?
I think whether he had stuck with the target or not, I think politically he probably has long-term done the right thing. I think the difference between 2030 and 2035 in climate change is negligible, so I don't have any problem with it in those terms. I think that the market, to a certain extent, will decide, and car manufacturers in terms of electric vehicles. The big gap, by the way, just very quickly, where I'm disappointed, as it were, is one of the reasons he's had to do this as well, is because there's been no investment in the kind of infrastructure you need to support an electric vehicle economy.
Seema?
I think that last point is absolutely right. This is actually a very, very weak announcement by Rishi Sunak, and an announcement that he made the day Parliament went into recess. I think this is somebody who's trying to hide from scrutiny about the impact of this decision on our future, the growth of our economy, our future growth, and also how the green economy is a big opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for where economies are going to grow, where we want to be competitive, to grow those jobs of the future, but also crucially to bring bills down. This is an admission of failure, that he has failed to see the investment we need within our electric vehicle infrastructure, within other areas as well. And what it has created is instability and uncertainty. The very thing we need to stabilise our economy, to make sure that we can bring inflation down, to keep interest rates down, is stability. He has chosen to do the opposite. And what all the commentators who have reacted to this with the evidence are saying as well is that this is creating instability for our automotive sector, other sectors, but will lead to higher prices for consumers and households in the future.
But has it done what Rishi Sunak says the motivation behind this announcement actually was, which is about having a more honest conversation about the true costs of net zero?
See, this is where it felt very discordant to me. I mean, politics is partly an art form, and it didn't work, in my view, as artistry, because he kept on saying, this is a new politics that I'm going to lead, where I'm going to be completely honest with the British people, take the tough decisions. And then he announced a lot of kind of not tough decisions. We're not going to do this. You don't have to pay for that. And then claimed, this is his new style. And then he put out claims that he had scrapped things that weren't going to be put forward.
Well,
so the whole thing, in terms of, and this was a big moment for him, it just felt all wrong.
Well,
it feels like
on its own terms.
Fantasy. It's fantasy economics, but it's also fantasy politics. With these announcements, he said that he's now cancelled policies that didn't exist.
Absolutely.
But
let's take on this. But hang on. Let's just take on this
point
because we're talking about it in the way that Steve has introduced. Rishi Sunak will never impose unnecessary and heavy-handed measures on you, the British people. We will still meet our international commitments and hit net zero by 2050. Here are the heavy-handed measures that he's talking about, except none of them, Ed, was government policy. He's scrapping non-existent policies.
And there were nobody else's policies either.
Or nobody else's. Maybe they should be, but they weren't. That's not very honest, is it?
Well, it was the dance of the 7 bins. I mean, but I'm glad we've dodged these bullets, frankly. I was lying awake at night worrying about the meat tax and having to share my SUV, with strangers in order to get to the gym.
What about your family? That wasn't honest politics. I mean, if he's painting himself in the way Steve has said, I'm having an honest conversation.
I know. I mean, in some ways it is very depressing because Britain is actually a leader in climate change. We've reduced our emissions by half. That started under the last Labour government. It continued by the Tories. We lead in renewable energy. And the other bad thing about the U-turn, quite apart from the fact that when governments do U-turns it's not great, is a loss of leadership because actually we are leaders in this debate on renewable energy. If you're then going to start talking to China about climate change, China's going to turn around to you and say, well, look, you admit these targets are too tough and are hitting people's pockets.
So the other thing is the timing. As a new Prime Minister a year ago, he had a bit of space to personify change. And to give an example from the past, John Major, when he came in 1990, similar position after Thatcher. Day one, he announced a review of her most unpopular policy, the poll tax. Clear indication it was going. He didn't wait a year briefing that he was going to keep it, which is what Sunak has done with net zero. So they briefed the Times quite recently. They weren't going to do any of this, and now they've done it. It doesn't feel right in terms of timing.
It all comes from the Uxbridge by-election.
Look,
Right, well, doesn't it? But, so it is short-term political expediency.
I think it's more than that. I think it's more than that. And I think this is hiding the failure of the government to really invest in a future that's going to bring down energy and other bills. Now, if you take as one example, if he wants honest politics, if he had adopted, for example, the warm homes target and insulation programmes that Labour had called for, we would have seen, even in the last 2 years since Labour announced it, 4 million homes better insulated and would have protected households from the massive spike in energy prices that we've seen. And part of why it's so important to invest in the green economy, if you take, for example, making Britain a green energy superpower by 2030, is that it will be long-term lower bills for households from £1,400
if Labour is that
year
committed
lower.
to these long-term investments, you have your own investment programme. That has been pushed back if you win the election next year, the £28 billion of commitment and investment in green policies. But you're not going to reverse some of the changes that Rishi Sunak has announced. You said that you would bring back the 2030 deadline to phase out petrol and diesel cars, But what about the targets to eliminate gas boilers?
That's right. We have said that on the cars.
And why not
on
the
gas boilers? I won't take responsibility, and we won't take responsibility for what has been a failure of the government to invest to make sure that household bills will be lower.
So you're not that committed to it then?
That isn't what we're saying. We're saying that where the government has admitted a failure, that this will be a cost without bringing down bills in the way that this policy should deliver.
But you are going to bring back the 2030 deadline, but not the other.
Climate change and lower bills have to go hand in hand. That's what all our policies have been about. And the really important thing about the 2030 target is that this is only applying to new cars. This is not applying to used cars, which is where most people will make their purchases. But the impact of this is going to be to confuse whether or not businesses should invest in EV technology, and which will delay bringing down the prices of electric vehicles for households.
All right, but there is a discussion about
long-term, for Britain to be a world leader in this.
Long-term, medium-term, short-term investments and spending and costs, because this is a previous former Conservative Chancellor in the Daily Telegraph, Tory MP systematically dishonest about £1 trillion of costs of net zero. Do you think the 2050 target should be abandoned, Alex?
I think in many respects it should, but we're signed up to an international treaty on this. And the reason I think it should, and you know, this gets quoted a lot, that the UK produces less than 1% of global carbon output. Unless the big polluters change their ways, we're not going to move the needle at all. And yet we are going to make the British people suffer, and we're going to completely ruin our industry. And I think actually what we should be looking at is finding ways to monetize, whether it's be through tariffs or penalties or whatever, products coming from the big polluters, and then we can use that money to fund the green transition and not expect Mrs. Miggins living in rural Wiltshire to put a heat pump in at her own cost.
But you do accept that the green transition must and should happen?
I think for multiple reasons there are ways that we should be funding this, and including looking at our own fossil fuels. We should be exploring things like small modular reactors and nuclear. I mean, we've just learnt yesterday, in fact, that Saudi Arabia, yet again, reducing the output of oil, and the cost of Brent crude is probably going to go up to $107 a barrel next year. That's going to increase inflation. There are multiple reasons due to global security that we need to think about energy.
Tackling climate and securing our economy are going to need to go hand in hand. If you take the automotive sector, the impact this could have on jobs, where thousands of jobs are dependent on our targets and the transition and the investment being made. Jobs in the automotive sector have dropped by 40% since 2010. Rishi Sunak should be saying that if he wants to be honest. Household insulation has been dropping by 90%. Rishi Sunak should be honest about that if he wants honest politics. This is a cover-up for failure of the government's choice to not invest in our economy for the long term. If we want our economy to grow, we need to have stability and we need to have certainty. And we need to have the jobs and the economy that's going to make us competitive for the long term. He's taken his eye off the ball utterly on that.
All right, well, let me just show you this headline response to that. It's just come out, actually, in BBC News. Electric cars firms still forced to sell more despite petrol ban delay. We'll see how that unfolds. Politically, though, to come back to your point on the Uxbridge by-election, that may have been the sort of launchpad for accelerating what Rishi Sunak was considering doing in terms of his approach to climate change. Is it going to work, though, politically, in terms of...
Well, it might do, actually, because I was listening to what you sort of challenging Seema on this point, and if you are going to take a purely cynical political look at the Prime Minister's decision, you know, I actually think ULEZ is the pollution extension in London is a good idea. But, you know, Sadiq Khan was on the ropes over that. And it will be interesting to see at the next election if the Tories say Labour are going to put this ban back to 2030. You, the working person, are going to be hit by this. You're going to have to sell your car or whatever. And I appreciate that is not what the policy is. It could well be something that works to Rishi Sunak's political advantage.
How significant a moment do you think this actually is? I mean, you heard Alex saying actually it hasn't been that radical, but how significant broadly in terms of the book that you've written called Turning Points? You explore critical moments that have shaped modern Britain, looking at elections. Is this significant in terms of the context of the next general election?
Well, if he turns this round, which he hopes he will, it would be a very significant moment. But I think what is really interesting in the build-up, I don't think he will, because I said I think it was misjudged on lots of different levels. But what is interesting in the build-up to this election, in terms of the book and turning points, is whether the 2024 election will be a turning point. And by that I don't mean whether Labour will win, but whether they then turn the UK around, because one of the things I looked with great interest at kind of what are regarded as turning points in Britain. Quite often Britain failed to learn the lessons of the Suez. We're still talking about the kind of issues in foreign policy that we were talking about after Suez. You know, are we part of Europe? Are we close to Europe? So quite often Britain failed to turn. But in 45 and 79, Labour 45, Tory 79, there was a huge turn. And some of the ingredients are in place for that now. The sense of nothing working, that Britain needs change. And yet we've got this cautious, incremental set of proposals from Labour. So if they win, will Britain just stagger on, as often happened in the 70s when there was a change of government? Or will they meet, I think, the mood for real big change?
In a Margaret Thatcher sort of way,
in a
then
Thatcher
in 79?
or the Attlee government way. They're the only two models. Now, there's a lot in place to give them the space to make big change, I think. But will they do it?
Zima?
I think this will be a turning point. I think people are already starting to feel
But what's the big
that
change?
there will be a different future. Look, I think the first thing is people will start to feel confident that their living standards will start to rise, that they can focus on their own futures, they can focus on the country future again. Look, what we have seen with the Conservatives has seen our economy crashed after 13 years of mismanagement. And it was because there were decisions made that reduced our resilience even before the pandemic. It reduced our resilience on our public services and on our economy. The belief that we can turn this around, that we can have an NHS that's fit for the future again, that we can see the investment in skills and opportunity, which I think on some of the other research out today where people feel less confident that they can access those opportunities. I think that hope and that optimism, as well as a new partnership with industry and government, will be one that will see a turning point for this country. Absolutely.
Well, Asima got a point. It may not be about big policy
No, it's
changes,
not going to be a turning point.
but the confidence and the belief that a Labour government will do better because everything is broken in Britain.
No, I think we had an exhausted centre-right government in 97 that was replaced by a very energetic centre-right government in 97 and an exhausted centre-right government in 2010 that was
So you're saying it may be replaced by a Labour government?
And I think personally, if I was a floating voter, I think that's a good thing. I don't want a scary radical government, and I completely agree, obviously, with Steve's analysis. He's written a whole book about it, so he knows more about it than I do.
But that's an interesting point. Maybe people don't want that radical transformation. They might just want the same sort of thing, but better.
I don't think they want the same sort of thing. I mean, if you look at there are sort of people from all wings of politics coalescing around the sense that some of the privatisations didn't work. Rivers, seas, the water companies. Just to give one example of 10,000.
But Labour's not committed to nationalising.
Exactly. So Keir Starmer's got a big call to make. He's got a programme now calibrated to win an election, as he sees it. But in the 70s, for example, there were one Tory Prime Minister, two Labour Prime Ministers. They all pursued roughly the same kind of policies and were swept away, overwhelmed by events. So does he want to be a change maker in control of events? If not, I think he could face a similar kind of fate, because I think the scale of the challenges are as big now as
But
then.
I also think there'll be a question on standards in politics as well.
All right. Well, let me just a brief...
Yeah, I think one thing that no one's mentioned, which is worth mentioning, it seems to me that the very narrow path that anybody who comes into power now has to walk, with international obligations, be they to treaties with the UN, be they with our relationships still with the EU through the Trade and Cooperations Agreement, be it with our obligations to whatever it may be, supranational bodies, people get in power saying, I'm going to bring about a revolution, it's all going to be done differently, and guess what? They can't, because they haven't got their hands on the tiller.
Let's talk about the junior doctors' strike, because junior doctors in England are today stepping up their industrial action in a full 48-hour walkout. Yesterday, they joined consultants for their first joint strike in the history of the NHS. Let's talk to a striking junior doctor, Anna Warrington. Hello to you, Anna. Let's just look at the costs, because NHS providers, which represents health managers, say the likely total cost of the junior doctors' walkouts, which totalled 19 days before this week, will be above £1 billion. How can you justify that cost to the NHS?
I'm so glad you asked. It is, I think, outrageous that the NHS is reliant on private contractors to complete everyday essential services. Where was the government's workforce planning when they slashed successive pay rounds year on year so that there are too few doctors and nurses to staff the NHS adequately without reaching out to private contractors who can reasonably charge a private contractor's
We'll come on to that specific cost, but I'm talking about the general cost of your walkouts. You seem to be saying that if there'd been more staff to sort of fill in the gaps while you and your colleagues go on strike, that would have been fine. But the £1 billion price tag in general for you walking out, how is that justifiable?
Well, I think it's justified by the strength of the crisis that we are facing in the healthcare service at the moment. I'm not just striking for pay restoration for myself. I am striking for NHS restoration for the public. Every day at work, I see one doctor doing the job of 3. I see operating theatres closed due to lack of staffing. The patients aren't getting value for money. The NHS is in crisis. This is due to chronic underfunding, a failure of workforce planning, and a failure to remunerate staffing adequately, and the result of which there simply aren't enough people left to make this service function, in addition to which the buildings are crumbling. The NHS is at the point of total destruction, in my experience at work and in those of my colleagues in addition.
Well,
it's worth investing 1.8 billion of finger pointing at the government so that they take action, because this is a crisis.
Anna, I'm going to go to our guest, but stay with us. I mean, what do you say to that, listening to Anna Warrington, spelling it out in apocalyptic terms?
Well, she makes a very compelling case, particularly the idea that the government can spend so much money getting private contractors in to cover for doctors who, from the doctor's perspective, aren't being paid enough. I mean, I don't support strikes. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it massively inconveniences the public, and when it comes to doctors, obviously, potentially puts people's lives at risk. But I don't shy away from the fact. Well, it's a much, much bigger debate. I mean, workforce planning and pay is one issue, but for me, the fundamental reform and change of the NHS is beyond urgent, and it should have started years and years ago. And we have this mantra with the NHS that every single NHS service has to be provided by an NHS organisation, which I think is absolutely ludicrous.
And the Conservatives have been in power for 13 years, and
absolutely.
This is the situation.
And, you know, my Tony Blair started this process with independent treatment centres, put in private contractors to provide routine medical care. If we'd carried on going down that path, I think we would have had a much more efficient NHS. You can't give the doctors a free pass. Their unions can be just as militant as other unions that we traditionally hold up as bogey people.
Anna, you were talking about this issue of how much is being paid to doctors while you are out on strike. Here's the headline: £3,000 a shift, how doctor strikes cost NHS fortune. People watching this programme will be aghast that that is what's being paid out because you're on strike.
I'm aghast as well that the NHS has to pay private contractor rates to meet their essential needs. And this isn't just on strike days, this is on a daily basis.
And is it time to go back to work then? That you and your colleagues to go back to work to stop that amount of money being spent on...
That's a lovely idea. Wouldn't it be nice if we went back to work and suddenly there wasn't a staffing crisis? There's a daily staffing crisis. It's not just on strike days. Every single day of the week there are theatres that are not filled with anaesthetists, so we can't operate. We could put out a rate of £3,000 a day to find one, but there aren't enough of us. That £3,000 rate reflects the maximum hourly rate recommended by the BMA for nighttime work for a consultant. That's a highly skilled individual bearing heavy responsibility at short notice in the middle of the night, and they are a private contractor. Think of your locksmith out of hours, okay? We're talking about someone with infinitely more responsibility in their work as a private contractor. It is up to the private contractor what they wish to charge on an hourly basis. The outrage is not the hourly rate of a private contractor. The outrage is that the NHS needs to use them to cover essential everyday services. And that is not on the individual to solve, that is on the government to finance the NHS adequately so that this does not arise.
Alex, is it time for Anna and her colleagues to go back to work?
Well, yeah, it is, because this is actually costing lives. Forget the cost of the money to the taxpayer. It is costing lives, and I find that reprehensible. But Anna makes a very good point here, and I think it's worth bearing in mind. And I support, in some respects, the call for medical staff to be paid a lot more, frontline medical staff.
How much
more? Because it's an international marketplace, right? And if we're not paying them, they're going to go to other countries. How much more? I don't sit there with the ledger of the NHS and know what can be afforded.
No, but I mean, they have asked for 35% increase.
What we should be considering instead is looking at ways for an income tax moratorium, not necessarily a pay rise, but looking at how much these people are paying in tax, hospital parking, whatever it may be, and look into those possibilities. But having lived in Belgium and looked at the European hybrid model of healthcare, which is sort of part private and part insurance driven, it works better. And what I find so funny about a lot of people who are going on strike, they say the government's rubbish at running the NHS, but it must remain government run. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Seema?
I would put the strike right firmly at the door of Rishi Sunak. Why is it?
How would you solve it?
How
would you solve it? If the Labour government comes in next year, people will say, will you pay Anna and her colleagues 35%?
It's got to be through negotiations. It's got to be through negotiations.
It hasn't worked so far, has it?
Well, why is it that Steve Barclay has not met with the juniors since May? Why is it that he hasn't met with the consultants to be in negotiations since March? Why is it that Rishi Sunak hasn't met them at all? When people ask the question about what the Tories are actually doing to be in negotiation and resolve the issues, the answer is really nowhere near enough. And Anna's point is absolutely right. There has been a total lack of workforce planning. Those who, my constituents who love the NHS, who use the NHS, they really value our doctors and nurses, and they know they're under strain.
What would you do if next year you win the election? Tell Anna what you would do as a Labour government to end this strike.
We have said very clearly that we would absolutely be negotiating. We would be in discussions, because it's in discussions about how we resolve the strike as well as how we plan for the workforce for the long term. And we have said that.
And would you meet their pay demands?
We have said that we wouldn't be able to meet 35%. We've said that already, because you have to do it within the fiscal framework that you have. But what we have said is that we would be in discussions not just about pay, but also about conditions and the need to invest in our NHS for the future. The issue is wider than pay, and Anna has also said that.
Can I just say in 10 seconds, the causes of these disputes, I've got more to say, and probably the disputes themselves will still be ongoing if Keir Starmer wins. And that's what I mean about he's got a big call to make, and where there are parallels with the 70s. Those staff shortages being highlighted are chronic and urgent. And when you said to me, maybe people just want it to be kind of the same, but a bit more competent, this illustrates why big change is required. The NHS is on its knees. I know that's a cliche, but that means big, including funding, has to be found quickly. Or else, as I say, we're in 70s territory.
But then the funding is never ending. I mean, every time we have one of these debates, people say just put more money into the NHS. It does not work unless you fundamentally reform how you deliver the service.
It's never ending.
There wasn't a national strike through the time that Labour was in power. There's a really important principle here, which is how you work with the workforce, with the sector, on planning for the future together. That has been completely missing.
But we now spend as much as our European peers. I mean, in terms of the overall spending.
On per head of spending? Well, I mean, Anna, can I just
We're up there with them.
We're not.
And what's going to Tory donors? There are major issues about how money is being spent.
Yeah, but the big difference is the funding model in terms of countries like France and Germany, which is not the same as here. So are you saying that should change as well?
I think everything should be on the table. I mean, this model does not work.
Right.
You've even got people like Wes Streeting saying this in the Labour Party. So, yeah, I think it's time to have that discussion.
I mean, is that the sort of reform you think people want too?
I think there needs to be a forensic look also at the reforms that have taken place, because some of them have actually cost quite a lot of money. It's in a very fractured, confused state. It's very hard to know who's in charge of what, partly as a result of some of the reforms that have gone through already. So when I hear that word reform, it's not a magic wand. You have to look,
and it means different things to different people.
Exactly. You have to look at what reform means.
Let me bring Anna back in. Listening to Seema Malhotra from the Labour Party, are you assured, Anna, that you would get a better deal if Labour win next year, from what you've heard?
I'm not assured that the solution is obvious, nor that any political party is in possession of it. But I think several things are true. One is that in this discussion earlier, we were talking about privatised services and how those have not succeeded. And I'm not convinced that we know that privatising any limb of the NHS will result in better value for the customer. If people are concerned about the moral repugnance of doctors charging £3,000 a shift now, imagine what it will be like when it's privatised, believe me.
Well, who's putting forward... Anna, hang on. Who's putting forward the idea that the NHS is going to be privatised?
Well, my understanding is that successive Conservative governments have beleaguered the NHS so that very few alternatives are available. I think introducing market forces into the health service, which was actually completed under Labour, has been extended further by the Conservatives' action to the extent that we find ourselves where we are now. There are private contractors in the NHS that they do charge more, and the NHS has to pay what they charge until the NHS is adequately staffed itself. And unfortunately, because of successive pay cuts to the tune of 35%, remember this is pay restoration, not a pay rise. There is now a workforce crisis that is driving the NHS further into the ground. The public are not getting value for money. Something must be done. I do think that the very least the government could do is come into negotiations with the doctors who do see what it's like on the ground.
Let the guests come back and answer some of your points.
I mean, these are the kind of points that sort of make my blood boil. I mean, luckily I'm on statins, which I pay for. So you remember that you do pay for some NHS services. And it is ludicrous to say that you can't have private contractors providing an NHS service, so long as it's free at the point of care, regardless of your income. Why on earth wouldn't you do that? I mean, it just seems completely bizarre. We don't worry about, we regulate our food standards, but we buy our food from private contractors. And this idea, the use of the word privatisation in this debate drives me round the bend, because it basically shuts down debate. The Tories are going to privatise the NHS. What does that mean? The companies that make your drugs are private companies. The companies that provide all the equipment in your hospitals are private companies. Why do we say that private companies cannot provide NHS services? It's just ludicrous.
Anna?
Well, I thought that there was some moral affront earlier at the idea that these strikes were costing money because private contracts had to be paid to cover the cost of the
That's not the same argument.
And that is the same on every day of the week. There are private contractors
but they are two very different things.
If as a patient, I consider it poor value for money. As a doctor, I am delighted that some of my pay can be restored through additional work.
I had an independent contractor in my constituency under the Blair government that completely removed all waiting lists for cataracts, driven out by the unions.
And you'd still support that, wouldn't you, Seema?
I want to make this point, which is that
for those at that point, you wouldn't be committed to reducing the amount of private sector involvement. As Alex quite rightly said, Wes Streeting has said, actually, we may be increasing it.
Wes Streeting has talked about this and having to make sure that we also bring down waiting lists. But no, I want to make this point because Wes Streeting has laid out our views on that. But where I have constituents who are saying to me they are feeling forced to go private because they can't access the treatment they need, it isn't just the strikes that have caused that problem. Definitely. And we need to make sure that we've got an NHS that's fit for the future. And that's why our workforce planning, investing in the doctors, the nurses, the district nurses, the health facilities in our communities are absolutely the #1 priority for Wes Streeting and for a Labour government.
Anna Warrington, thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about some statistics from the British Social Attitude Survey. I didn't sell that very well, did I? We're going to have an interesting discussion about some data from the British Social Attitude Survey that's just been published, marking its 40th year of mapping Britain's cultural and political landscape. But first of all, before we do, you heard it referenced in the headlines from that sketch from the two Ronnies. What class group do you feel you belong to, Steve?
Middle class.
Middle class. Alex?
Definitely middle class now, but my dad was a lorry driver, so I might claim working class origins.
Seema?
I'd probably agree with that. I came from very working class origins. In my heart, I still kind of feel that, but I think in terms of where we are, you'd say middle class.
Ed?
Have a guess.
I'll leave that. Upper class?
Middle class.
Middle class.
Middle class aspiring to upper.
Does it matter, Seema?
Look, I think there is a couple of things that are so interesting from the research. The first is that people feeling that class still makes a difference, and more people feeling that. I think almost over 3/4 of people feeling that your class can make a difference to how you get on. I think that's really worrying for the feeling that maybe that class differences are being more entrenched in society, and that has got to be a shift for certainly is for Labour to be thinking about, for where we think about opportunities and barriers to opportunities.
It is interesting the way people see themselves or perceive themselves. This headline in the Daily Telegraph, inverted snobbery could mean rich fool themselves about being working class. 1 in 3 people in top-earning households still identify with lower groups despite their wealth. It used to be about income. has that changed dramatically?
I don't think it's ever wholly been about income. I mean, when I see interviews with Paul McCartney, he always says, "Oh, I'm working class, actually." No, I don't think he's short of money, and I think his income's not bad.
Good Paul McCartney
but it's about. Thank you very much. I could do John Lennon as well. But so it's about place and background.
Right.
But it's not just that. It is about income, and as Seema suggests, it's about opportunity and a sense that opportunities are removed from quite a lot of people with working class backgrounds, and it's reinforced when you see, you know, the sort of Etonians ruling Britain, Cameron and all, Johnson, and so I think it is as strong as ever, but it is more than income. It's about whether government provides opportunity, partly for those who aren't born into it.
Absolutely. The wealth divide has gone up, social mobility has gone down. If you're not from a rich family, you're not buying a house. I'm 40 this year and I don't own a house. My parents were never able to give me money for a deposit. And also on top of that, when you look at the cost of education and the professionalisation of lots of sectors, and I take journalism as one of them. So I trained as a journalist. I went to journalism school. It cost a fair whack of money. I couldn't get a loan for that. I did get a loan for that, but it wasn't sort of a government-backed loan. So I had to pay that back myself on top of my undergraduate student loan. Back in the day, if you wanted to be a journalist, you turned up at the scene with a notepad, did it straight out of school as an apprentice. I think what we're finding now is a lot of the professionalisation of a lot of sectors and the ruling classes, if you will, all coming from a very similar background with very similar ideologies and this growing sense of being out of touch with the bulk of people.
I think this sense of inequality is really, really deep. And there was research that we had this year that showed that if a child born this year has got less than a third of a chance of a third of likelihood of owning a home by the time they're 50. Now, there is a real question about not just social mobility, but also people being able to just have rising living standards and meet their aspirations, and for their children and grandchildren. That is a really core area of political debate now. And it is why one of our 5 missions is about tackling barriers to opportunity. They're not going to be easy solutions, but we've got to look at the structures that are holding people back.
Is that a damning indictment of the last sort of 10, 15 years or so, when people feel they're not going to be better off than their parents, if you want to use that metric, or they might not be able to ever afford a home, or whether or not metrics should change in terms of...
No, I think it's a damning indictment of the British class system. I mean, arguably under Margaret Thatcher, a lot of kind of opportunity was unleashed, and everyone will sign up to the mantra in the belief of equality of opportunity, not necessarily the equality of outcome. And it is a very difficult nut to crack. And businesses, for example, have to really lean into this. I mean, I did a lot of work on diversity when I was a minister with the media industry, and the hidden obstacles that people, you know, first of all, people hire people who look like them, who come from similar backgrounds. Secondly, they are blissfully unaware of the kind of obstacles that are in the way of people. So if somebody is turning up late regularly, they think, oh, that's a lazy person. No, they're not. They have different obstacles to you when you were starting at work, and people don't think that through. And I do believe in positive discrimination, whether it's based on class or ethnic background, because you don't have equality of opportunity in this country, and you do need to help people in different ways because they don't have the same opportunities that kids of people around this table.
I think I put a lot of the opportunities I had down to going to a grammar school. Margaret Thatcher, a grammar school girl and a grocer's daughter, and this has never been on the table. Every time people bring it up, it's sort of treated like it's on the table and ghoulish. Not for a long time now.
Yeah, does it really lead to social mobility, grammar schools these days? People would argue actually they're not.
Because you then create all the secondary moderns and people are dismissed as failures at 11. So I think it would have the opposite impact with respect. It's very interesting though. When I was up at the Edinburgh Festival in August, Keir Starmer wrote this piece for the Scotsman. And I kind of thought, God, because he was talking about smashing the class ceiling and all this sort of thing. And I think there is a bit of him which is very conscious of this issue. But he was doing it in Scotland because he's being attacked from the left by the SNP. And he doesn't talk about it as much in England, where actually class is, I think, more of an issue probably than it is in Scotland. The question is how you provide the opportunities that enable people to break that ceiling. And that is a really challenging issue. And to go back to, if it is to be a turning point, the how is what they haven't answered yet.
I mean, the bank of mum and dad is still considered to be one of the big drivers of inequality,
Yeah,
isn't it?
exactly,
Which will be difficult for Keir Starmer too. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests, and I'll be back on Monday with more Politics Live. And Politics UK is here at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer tomorrow. So please join us then. From all of us here, bye-bye.